Everything's gone to hell since we smuggled that filthy creature off-world. First a Justicar shows up. Now you. At least I can take pleasure in turning your head into a pulpy mass!
Heads up!
Shepard, that's what!
I want to start right off the bat by saying Mass Effect 2 is a good game. It's not just a good game, it's a classic that will probably continue to be relevant years into the future. That being said, what can be great in the short term doesn't always continue to play out well in the long run. And I firmly believe Mass Effect 2 is one of the most clear examples of failing to understand your own success. And I'm not referring to the devs on that one. Because while a narrative like this isn't uncommon at all within the game industry, this entry in particular carries a lot of history with it. What I'm talking about is that Mass Effect 2 was the first game to finally pull off an industry-wide dream. To make a blockbuster-style cinematic experience and actually get not only mainstream approval, but the broad kind of hype you rarely see outside of movie trilogies. Or I should say, used to rarely see, because now we live in a world where a new game release can outshadow the biggest films of the year. Sure, certain franchises garnered a lot of sales before this, but even then there was always a level of dismissal. It was a new medium, just like TV, movies, theater, and books before it. There was a good deal of resistance to actually acknowledging video games as art. Mass Effect 2 was the first time I really started to see that conversation change, when for the first time it seemed like more people were into the new release than not, when everyone was excited to talk about the same thing, Mass Effect 2. Playing it again for the 7th or 8th time, it's clear right off the bat why. One thing you might notice while going through the trilogy is that Mass Effect 1 and 2 have a much larger gap between them than 2 and 3 do. Not just visually, but in feel as well. Mass Effect 3 comes off on first impression as much more of an update on 2, whereas 2 feels much more separate to 1 rather than just some bloated standalone expansion. In a way, Mass Effect 2 is sort of trying to pull off the same thing that Fallout 4 did, where it had this combat system that was a carryover translation of older RPG entries, that most fans were fine with, but only really because it wasn't technically bad and everyone had pretty much just gotten used to it. Except Mass Effect 2 pulled this off way before anyone really had the time to get used to it. Which, combined with the fact that Mass Effect 2's changes were generally well received, unlike Fallout 4, I think explains why this combat redesign went over much better, even though technically not all that much is actually upgraded. Recoil matters a little bit more now, though weapon spread continues to be the main factor in accuracy. Overheating is largely replaced with sort of ammunition. There's a bigger variety of firearm types that have a few different mechanics rather than just being different stats. Though, with the ammo one, is that exactly a step forward? I mean, in terms of the way it was implemented. Because the execution in this case is universal ammo, the thing most people hate in most other games, but seems to get sort of a free pass in Mass Effect. Look, I'm not trying to argue that Mass Effect 2 should have stuck with overheating. It made weapons feel very floaty, it was too easy to abuse the cooling rate to fire indefinitely, and it forced weapons to do less damage for the sake of balance. But is the way they fixed all that really just a step forward? Because to me, this universal ammo mechanic feels much more like they sidestepped to a different system that was just simpler and more common to patch the problem quickly and without much thought needed. I can understand the desire for a safe choice that is least likely to upset fans, but if you take a risk in your first entry and then drop it, that kind of says everything it needs to about their confidence in the more unique aspects of Mass Effect. Look, how about this instead? Keep the thermal clips universal. In fact, make it so that they're less common and one thermal clip cools most weapons completely, unless they're extra big or special or something. Bring back the overheating system from 1, but split it into 2 bars. The main one functions just like the heat gauge did in Mass Effect 1, except now you can instantly quote-unquote reload by spending a thermal clip. The second bar has a lot more capacity, but barely cools on its own. basically representing how much accumulative heat has been absorbed that can't be vented passively. You'd be able to get away with abusing the overheat mechanic for a bit without expending a thermal clip, but eventually you'd need to pop one. And it would work best if the more you filled up your first passive heat gauge, the faster your second accumulative heat gauge fills up too, punishing you for trying to play constantly in that last red zone. If you prefer to reload a lot, suddenly when you reload becomes a big tactical choice. Sure, you can spend a thermal clip to get your gun working right away in a tricky sitch, but if it hasn't accumulated a lot of passive heat yet, then that's also wasting a bit of the thermal clip's value, in exchange for the convenience of immediacy. Obviously, different weapon types would play into these systems, with some favoring one style of play over the other, or going for a jack-of-all-trades of some sort. In fact, this would be a good way to integrate the old/new attachment system back into the game, where you could swap out cooling systems to tweak them to your needs. Maybe with a brand of weapon or modification part making the gun function exactly like a traditional Mass Effect 2 universal ammo only gun, or vice versa. But instead of inching towards that, it's clear that the intention for this game was to move away from its roots. In some cases, this is still a good thing. The opening, where they basically wipe the slate clean and give a great excuse for new players to not know anything, is pretty genius. But it also reveals a major crutch of the game as well: the constant reuse of epic shots and soaring music to keep you invested in the scenes. In Mass Effect 1, by necessity, the use of Hollywood-esque action shots was much fewer and farther between, so when they did pop up, it felt special and earned. In 2, I couldn't even keep track of how many random missions had some kind of cutscene with the gang running away from something exploding, running down a hallway to escape, or the Normandy flying away from something. Most of the time, for no reason other than to make it feel like the mission meant more than it actually did. When a simple fade to the mission results screen wouldn't just waste less of your time, but might actually add some real weight depending on exactly where the fade to finish was placed. Like, for example, very rarely does Mass Effect 2 use the really easy narrative trick of cutting a scene on a line or action to emphasize it. Instead, cutscenes drag and drag to show you everyone leaving and the door closing and then the ship pulling away. It's all in the service of showing that video games can pull off these same impressive shots now that films could. The big difference being that movies are generally an hour and a half to 3 hours long, so there's only so much time to shove set pieces and CGI in your face. In a game that can take 30 to 50 plus hours, going for the style of a Hollywood blockbuster the whole time means you're going to be seeing these animations play out perpetually. And for logistical reasons, a lot of these animations are going to look similar or even be reused just because of how much content needs to be made for the game. But if the only issue was that it was annoying that the game keeps ending scenes repetitively, it wouldn't be that big of an issue. You can just skip the scene, and honestly, that's what I've noticed a lot of people doing. No, the issue is that this plays into a bigger theme with Mass Effect 2, that every section of the game kind of blurs together. In terms of these cutscenes, it's much harder for me to remember from exactly what part of the game it's from, because visually you could transplant the focus of these animations to any part of the game, and it wouldn't make much of a difference. And this bleeds over very clearly into the way missions are structured as well. In Mass Effect 1, there were some side areas, but the majority of the game's content was focused into different story planets. You had Therum, Noveria, Pharos, and Vermeer as bigger maps packed with side quests and plot content. Mass Effect 2 adjusts the scale and placement of these elements, though. Instead of concentrating the content into denser areas, 2 is broken up into a series of self-contained missions. This means there are certainly way more missions to complete, but they're all either shorter, or if they've got some heft, then they're probably kinda repetitive. If your instanced missions are in an external space that only exists for as long as you're in that mission, then it becomes much more difficult to properly mix the combat and non-combat aspects of Mass Effect. In Mass Effect 1, opening up a new room could lead to anything from an enemy encounter to a friendly NPC hub with merchants and side quests. In Mass Effect 2, because you can't return to these areas, and because the space they occupy only exists for the mission, it's impossible to do this. There are NPC encounters scattered around, but if you notice, they're always either an injured/in trouble character who either leaves or leads to a fight somehow. Or it's the last room, and it's either a boss or a final dialogue wrapping up the mission. The only real way they interrupt the pace of fight after fight after fight is your companions commenting on something in the environment. But then, because Mass Effect 2 has a huge number of companions, this can't be an in-depth conversation unless it's a crew loyalty mission. Though, even then, it's mostly just a companion giving a take, and then you asking questions/judging them for it. Almost never is it you or a companion actually taking an action yourself. It's always a reaction to someone else's past action that you weren't even there for. An indirect example of this is the fact that everyone in the game is giving you a hard time for working with Cerberus, a clearly evil organization with a lot of analogs to white supremacist groups.
I know what we're doing here, but what's Cerberus's long-term goal?
The advancement of the human race. Nothing more, nothing less.
Part of some organization, Cerberus, that runs secret tests like this. They treated me like a lab animal.
Your ideals have cost us more than you can imagine. The technology from that base could have secured human dominance in the galaxy against the Reapers and beyond.
Human dominance? Or just Cerberus?
Strength for Cerberus is strength for every human. Cerberus is humanity. I should have known you'd choke on the hard decisions. Too idealistic from the start.
Except you're never given a choice in this. So it's one of those instances everyone complains about where you're morally reprimanded for a thing the game forced you to do. And in no way can you actively make an impact on this. Your only options are to passively respond to others bringing it up in such a way that no substantial action is ever taken on it. A more direct example of this is when I was replaying the DLC Overlord. As a quick refresher, basically Cerberus was experimenting with human to AI interfacing in order to find a way to puppet master all the Geth. There's a guy hooked up to the station's virtual intelligence, and this has caused the mechs to go haywire and attack the staff. Throughout the mission, it's foreshadowed that all is not as it seems. The VI tries to communicate with you, and the mechs occasionally act strangely. Midway through, when encountering a particular mech, it's clear that there's something more going on, since the mech indicates that it's asking for help.
I hear you, Doctor. We've hit the override at Vulcan Station and are moving on. Shepard out.
Yet, there's no choice or anything to even really take this new info into account. Shepard and their team don't even seem to notice, as if the option to investigate further was cut or never even considered in the first place. In Mass Effect 1, a scene like this would have been the climax of the mission. There would have been a whole scene where the team argues about the hypothetical ethics of the situation. But in 2, we're just railroaded into having the story events play out in what would be the most dramatic fashion for an action movie. And railroading is kind of the perfect analogy too. It feels like a DM or GM or storyteller, whatever pen and paper RPG you play with, who had one great campaign in their new homebrew setting. Now the DM is so in love with their lore and the players are so hyped just to continue a story they're emotionally invested in, they're all just fine cutting corners. The DM has a lot of time invested in the setting and now wants to hit players the same way their favorite media hits them. The players go along with this extremely guided experience because they're just happy to see the characters they like in much bigger and grander situations. And while in the short term, I think there's a lot of value to coming at a sequel with this kind of mentality, for example, some of the scenes with returning characters are pulled off spectacularly compared to other franchises. But in the long run, if you double down on that style, you're going to end up with Mass Effect 3. rush storylines in favor of set pieces, planets that are just combat arenas connected by hallways, and simplified choices in order to push players in a streamlined direction. And this isn't just an issue for Mass Effect 3. The consequences for this overarching design direction are present already in 2. The best mission of the entire game, the Reaper Corps, is the clearest example of this. Or I should say, what could have been the best mission of the entire game, since it's handicapped both in length and by its poor implementation of Mass Effect 1 enemies. The entire location here is fantastically designed, the atmosphere spot on, and then any creepiness is ruined when the combat encounters just end up being swarms of husks. Husks are a supportive enemy type. By themselves, they're boring opponents who rush you and exist mostly to distract and tarp at you, while more agile and tactical enemies abuse the opportunity to flank your position. Except in order to create some kind of slapdash zombie movie scene, the entire level is just swarms of them running at you. No, wait, there are some other enemies peppered in, except they're scions, really slow-moving, easy-to-avoid bullet sponges, aka the worst and most boring enemy type to combine with husks, because they can't take advantage of the husks disabling your movement due to their own slow speed. The combat puzzles of this entire mission become busy work, not fun encounters. Any atmosphere the level had is destroyed, and it's over quickly because it's clear the developers understood these fights were not fun or scary, and it's these kind of cut corners and attitudes that snowball the longer everyone ignores them. Sure, at first you get a hype game that hits every possible thrill you could hope for as a fan. We'll have your protag die, we'll have an even eviler villain, you'll have to work with bad guys, all your characters can die at the end, the Reaper's made out of people. Everything is cranked up to an extreme, with no thought as to where Mass Effect is supposed to go from there. And since the praise was near universal and uncritical, now EA is just sitting there thinking, we hit the formula. Now we can just do a sequel that doubles down on everything and release it unfinished. They'll love it. It's genius. Mass Effect 3 is the logical conclusion of Mass Effect 2. It's taking every design choice and change in 2 and just continuing down that path. Who knows? If the response to Mass Effect 2 had been positive but actually discussed its issues more critically like was more so the case with 1, then perhaps EA would not have been confident in releasing 3 way too early. Maybe they wouldn't have doubled down on the action set pieces and maintained the balance Mass Effect 2 did. And if those things had changed, I think it's very probable that Mass Effect 3's ending would have been very different, and the arc leading up to whatever replaced it would have loads more depth. But no,